John Lennon's creepy last recording hours before the Yendi. The last morning of the world. New York City, December 8th, 1980. A Monday. An ordinary, gray, winter morning that the city received without ceremony, its streets moving with their usual indifferent urgency. Somewhere in the Dakota building on Central Park West, John Lennon was waking up for the last time. He did not know this. But what if the day itself knew? What if the hours that followed carried, in their small details and quiet moments, the unmistakable signature of an ending? And what if the people who were there with him in those final hours felt it, without being able to name it, like a cold draft from a door that hasn't been opened yet? The year is 1980. John Lennon was 40 years old, and for the first time in years, perhaps for the first time since the early days in Liverpool when music was still pure possibility rather than industry obligation, he was genuinely, quietly happy. The 5 years of domestic seclusion at the Dakota, years of baking bread, of raising Sean, of deliberately, consciously stepping back from the machinery of fame, had done something to him that no amount of therapy or political activism or creative experimentation had managed to do. They had given him back himself. He had returned to music that year with Double Fantasy, an album that was both a declaration of domestic contentment and a profound artistic statement about the value of ordinary life. The reviews had been mixed. Some critics found it too gentle, too comfortable, insufficiently combative for the man who had written Working Class Hero. But John had not made it for the critics. He had made it for the same reason he had always made music when he was at his best, because it was true. And now, on this December morning, he was going back to the record plant studio on West 44th Street, a place he had come to love for its particular, slightly chaotic warmth, its engineers who treated him not as a monument, but as a musician, its atmosphere of productive, unceremonious work. He was recording new material, songs for a follow-up album, ideas that had been accumulating with the particular, urgent momentum of a creative period that felt, to those around him, like a man running towards something rather than away. He was scheduled to work on a track called Walking on Thin Ice, a Yoko composition that John had been producing with focused, almost obsessive attention. He loved the song. He had told people it was going to be Yoko's first major hit, speaking of future with the certainty of a man who planned to be present for it. He had plans, studio plans, travel plans, the ordinary, accumulating architecture of a life being actively lived. He spoke of them that morning with the casual confidence of someone who assumes, as all living people must assume in order to function, that tomorrow will come. Tomorrow would not come. But John Lennon did not know this. And in the hours between that gray December morning and the moment when everything stopped, he went to the studio, and he made music, and he said things that the people who heard them would spend the rest of their lives turning over in their hands, trying to understand what they had been holding without knowing it. Hey, before we continue with this incredible story, I need to give you an important warning. Many subscribers have reported that YouTube has removed their subscriptions without notice. Just take a quick look at the red button below to make sure you're still subscribed to the channel. I don't want you to miss any of the exclusive content that's coming up. And while you're there, leave that powerful like. That helps me a lot with the algorithm. Oh, and tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? I love getting to know every amazing person who is part of this community. Your participation makes all the difference. Let's interact. John Lennon in December 1980 was a man who had undergone a transformation so complete that those who had known him in his most turbulent years sometimes struggled to reconcile the two versions. The sharp-edged, sardonic, relentlessly provocative figure of the late 60s and early 70s had not disappeared. It was still there in the wit, in the quickness of his responses, in the laser-focused intelligence that never truly switched off. But it had been joined by something else. Something quieter, more patient, more grounded in the specific textures of an ordinary day. He had spent 5 years learning to be a father. Not the distant, distracted, famous person version of a father, but the kind who made breakfast and read bedtime stories and measured his days not by creative output or public reception, but by the quality of his presence in his son's life. It had changed him in ways that he spoke of openly and without embarrassment, with the particular, unguarded honesty of a man who has stopped caring about appearing cool and started caring about being true. The record plant studio, when John arrived that December morning, received him in its usual way, with the warm, slightly chaotic normalcy of a working creative space. The engineers greeted him. The equipment was already running. The coffee was hot. Yoko was with him, as she had been through every phase of the double fantasy sessions, her presence simultaneously creative partner, anchor, and fellow artist. John moved through the studio with an energy that those present would later describe, unanimously and with the particular weight of retrospect, as exceptionally good. He was focused. He was enthusiastic. He was talking about the future, about the next album, about a planned tour, about songs he was hearing in his head that he hadn't yet had time to capture. He was, in every visible sense, a man in full forward motion. The studio had a particular quality that day. The winter light came through the high windows at a specific angle. The city outside moved through its Monday with its usual indifference. Inside, the equipment hummed, the coffee cooled in its cups, and John Lennon prepared to record what would be, though no one in the room could know it, the last music of his life. The work began in the mid-morning. The track they were focused on, Walking on Thin Ice, was a song with an interesting, slightly unsettling quality that John had been drawn to from the first time he heard Yoko's concept for it. It was a dance track, pulsing and urgent, built around a lyrical image of precarious movement across unstable ground, of the thin line between safety and catastrophe. John had thrown himself into its production with the focused enthusiasm he brought to projects that genuinely excited him. The session moved with the particular, organic rhythm of a creative process in full flow. Takes were recorded, listened to, discussed with the quiet precision of musicians who know what they are looking for and are methodically finding it. John was in the control room and in the recording booth alternately, his attention moving between the technical and the intuitive with the practiced ease of a man who had spent 20 years in studios and had never lost his fundamental, visceral relationship with the music itself. The engineer on duty that day, a young man named Lee DiCarlo who had worked with John through much of the double fantasy sessions, later recalled the atmosphere as being, in his words, like any other good day in the studio. Nothing portentous, nothing overtly strange. John was sharp, engaged, occasionally funny. He made precise creative decisions with the quiet authority of a man who knows exactly what he wants and has the skill to communicate it. But there were moments, small moments that DiCarlo and others present would later return to, examining them in the harsh, clarifying light of what came after, trying to determine whether they had been signs or simply the ordinary texture of a Monday in December with a musician who happened to be more reflective than usual. At one point, John stopped a playback of a completed section and sat for a moment in the silence that followed, his head slightly bowed, listening to the absence of sound with the same focused attention he had given the music. "That's it," he said finally, to no one in particular. "That's exactly it." He did not explain what he meant. The engineer noted it because the tone was different from the usual producer's satisfaction, quieter, more inward, less about the track and more about something the track had touched. Later in the session, during a break, John stood at the studio window looking out at the winter street below. A car passed. A pedestrian hurried against the cold. The ordinary December life of West 44th Street moved beneath him with its usual purposefulness. "Strange, isn't it?" John said, to Yoko, who was beside him. "How much is going on down there that we never know about?" It was not an unusual observation. It was the kind of thing a thoughtful person might say on any given day. But DiCarlo, who overheard it, found himself unable, afterward, to recall it without a particular quality of unease. The session continued through the afternoon. Walking on Thin Ice was taking its final shape, the production decisions accumulating into something that John kept describing as exactly right, a phrase he used more than once that day, with a repetitive insistence that the people present found, in retrospect, slightly unusual in its frequency. It was during a break in the late afternoon that the atmosphere in the studio shifted, subtly and without announcement, into something that those present struggled to describe in the years that followed. Not dread, not premonition, neither of those words felt accurate enough. Something more like the particular quality of attention that settles over a space when something is being felt but not yet understood. John had been talking with engineer Jack Douglas, who had been with him through the entirety of the Double Fantasy project, about the plans for the next album. The conversation was specific, practical, track listings, potential collaborators, recording schedules. The future, mapped out in the ordinary language of a working musician. And then, in the middle of that conversation, John stopped. He looked at Douglas with an expression that the engineer would spend years trying to categorize. "You know what I've realized?" John said. His voice was quiet, thoughtful, carrying none of the usual edge of performance. "I've spent so much of my life being afraid. Afraid of failing. Afraid of not being enough. Afraid of what people thought." He paused. "I'm not afraid anymore. I don't know exactly when that happened, but it did." Douglas, unsure what to say, simply nodded. John smiled. Not the sardonic, public smile of the famous John Lennon, but something smaller and more genuine. "Good," he said, apparently to himself. "That's good." And then the conversation moved on, back to track listings and recording schedules, and the moment passed the way moments do, without anyone understanding what it had contained. There was another moment. Toward the end of the afternoon, a studio assistant, a young woman who had been working at the record plant for less than a year and who had developed the particular, awestruck fondness for John that his genuine warmth in professional settings consistently produced in people who worked closely with him, brought him a cup of coffee. He took it and looked at her directly, with the full, focused attention that was one of his most consistent and unusual qualities. "Do you love what you do?" he asked her. She said yes, a little startled by the directness of the question. "Good," John said. "Don't ever stop. Whatever they tell you about what's practical and what isn't, don't stop." He held her gaze for a moment longer, then looked back at his coffee. She left the room and stood in the corridor for a moment, oddly moved by an exchange she could not have explained. The last take of "Walking on Thin Ice" was recorded in the early evening. When the playback finished, John listened in the control room with his eyes closed, perfectly still. When it ended, he opened his eyes and said, "That's the one. That's the one we'll use." He looked at Douglas. "We did it, Jack." His voice carried a finality that was, the engineer told interviewers decades later, slightly different from the usual finality of a completed track. "It was like he was talking about more than the song," Douglas said. "But I couldn't have told you what." John and Yoko left the record plant in the early evening. Before leaving, John did something that DiCarlo, in all the sessions they had worked together, had never seen him do. He stopped at the door, turned, and looked back at the studio, at the equipment, the mixing board, the microphones, the physical space of a place where he had spent months making music, with a long, quiet look that DiCarlo described as the way you look at a place you love when you're leaving it. Then John Lennon walked out of the record plant and into the December night. He was carrying a tape of "Walking on Thin Ice." He had told the engineers he wanted to listen to it at home. He wanted to hear how it sounded in a different space. He was already thinking about the next session. The evening of December 8th, 1980, moved through its hours with the particular, terrible normalcy of a night that does not know what it is carrying. John and Yoko returned to the Dakota from the record plant, arriving in the early evening. The building, that vast, Gothic-inspired fortress on Central Park West, its gargoyles watching the street below with their carved, impassive eyes, received them as it always did. There were people outside the Dakota that evening, as there often were. Fans, waiting with the patient devotion that John's return to public life had re-energized. Among them, a young man who had earlier that day presented John with a copy of Double Fantasy and received, in return, John's signature in a moment of genuine attention. John noticed the fans. He spoke to some of them briefly, with the warmth that had become, in these recent years, more consistent and less guarded than it had once been. The 5 years of domestic seclusion had, paradoxically, made him more comfortable with the public versions of himself, less threatened by the exposure, more willing to simply be present in the moment of encounter. He went upstairs. He listened to the tape of "Walking on Thin Ice" in the apartment. According to Yoko, he was pleased with it, excited about it, talking about the mix and about what he wanted to do in the next session. The ordinary, forward-moving conversation of a man with plans, with a future, with music still forming in the unreachable interior of a mind that had never once stopped generating. At some point in that evening, they decided to go out to dinner. A restaurant they liked. A Monday night in December, a decision as ordinary as breathing. They went downstairs. They stepped out of the Dakota into the December cold, into the night, into the city that had given John Lennon the particular, imperfect version of peace he had been searching for his entire life. What happened next in the darkness outside that building, in the shadow of the Gothic archway on the pavement of Central Park West, belongs not to this story but to history, to the record of the world's worst moments, to the permanent, devastating archive of what human beings are capable of doing to each other. At 10:50 p.m. on December 8, 1980, John Lennon was shot 4 times outside the Dakota Building. He was taken to Roosevelt Hospital, 2 blocks away, where he was pronounced dead on arrival. He was 40 years old. The city that had received him, that had given him its streets and its studios and its gray winter mornings, went into a silence that settled over its usual noise like something final. In Central Park, across the street from the building where he had lived, people began to gather without being asked, drawn by the gravitational pull of shared grief, standing in the cold with candles and flowers, and the particular, helpless solidarity of people who have lost something they cannot replace. The tape of Walking on Thin Ice that John had been carrying when he left the record plant was found near his body. The last physical object connected to the last music he ever made, lying on the pavement of a December night in New York City, containing the last sounds he had shaped with his hands and his attention and the restless, extraordinary intelligence that had, for 40 years, turned what he heard and felt and feared and loved into music. The world woke on December 9, 1980, to a grief that was genuinely collective in a way that few events in modern history had managed to produce. The news moved through every country, every language, every demographic that had ever been touched by John Lennon's music, which was to say, almost every human being alive. Radio stations played his songs without interruption. Newspapers led with his face. Governments issued statements. Ordinary people stood in the streets of cities they shared with no one famous, and wept. In New York, the gathering in Central Park grew through the night and into the following days until it had become something that defied easy categorization. Not quite a vigil, not quite a protest, not quite a concert, but something that partook of all three. People brought flowers, candles, records. They sang his songs in the December cold with the particular, aching quality of people singing music that has just acquired a new and devastating meaning. Imagine, in my life, give peace a chance. The anthems of a life dedicated to the proposition that the world could be better than it was. Walking on Thin Ice was released as a single in January 1981. It became Yoko's first top 10 hit, precisely as John had predicted. The irony of that prediction, made with the casual confidence of a man who assumed he would be there to see it fulfilled, was not lost on anyone who knew the story. The song itself, with its lyrical image of precarious movement across unstable ground, acquired in the context of what had happened a resonance that its creators could not have intended and that listeners found, alternately, unbearable and profound. Jack Douglas, the producer who had been with John through the final session, gave many interviews in the years that followed. He returned, consistently, to the same moments: the long look at the studio before leaving, the conversation about fear, the particular quality of John's attention that day. He was careful, always, to resist the temptation to retroactively assign them meaning they might not have carried in the moment. "I don't want to make it into something mystical," he said, in one interview given 20 years after the fact. He was a man having a good day in the studio. Maybe that's all it was. But I also know that I've never forgotten any of it. Not 1 minute of it. And I've asked myself, every day since, whether that means something. Yoko Ono completed the album they had been planning, releasing it in 1984 under the title Milk and Honey. It contains some of the songs John had been working on in his final period, including a track called Grow Old With Me, a tender, acoustic piece about the simple, radical act of sharing a life with someone. It was recorded on a home cassette player, its production rough and unfinished, its emotion entirely unguarded. It was, in its quietness and its honesty, perhaps the most John Lennon thing John Lennon ever recorded. He would never grow old, but he left behind the song about wanting to. The record plant studio on West 45th Street closed in 1987. Its equipment was sold, its rooms repurposed. The physical space where John Lennon spent the last hours of his creative life making music about walking on thin ice no longer exists as a studio. But the recordings exist. The tapes exist. The music that was made in those final hours persists, the way all genuine things persist, not because the world has chosen to preserve them, but because they contain something true, and true things are difficult to entirely extinguish. December 8th, 1980, exists now in the permanent archive of music history as a date that carries more weight than any single day should have to carry. It is the day the world lost John Lennon, but it is also, and this is the part that the world sometimes forgets in the enormity of the loss, the day that John Lennon spent making music. Doing the thing that had defined him since he was a teenager in Liverpool, holding a guitar for the first time and discovering that the distance between what he felt and what he could express had just been, miraculously, closed. He spent his last creative hours doing what he loved, in a place he was comfortable, with people who respected him, working on music that excited him, talking about a future he was genuinely looking forward to. There is something in that, something that resists the simple tragedy of the narrative, something that insists on being noticed alongside the grief. He was happy. On that day, in those hours, he was genuinely, quietly, deeply happy. The engineer Lee DiCarlo, who was present for those final hours in the studio, kept working in music for decades after. He spoke of John Lennon frequently, always with the particular, careful honesty of someone who knows they are one of the last custodians of a set of memories that belong, in some sense, not just to them, but to everyone. He described John, consistently, not as a legend, not as the myth that the decades of posthumous reverence had constructed, but as a musician. A working musician, coming into the studio on a Monday, making decisions about a mix, drinking coffee, talking about the future. That's what I want people to understand, DiCarlo said, in one of his final interviews. He was just there, making music. That's what he did. That's who he was. All the rest of it, the politics, the fame, the history, all of that was real, too. But in the studio, on that day, he was just a musician. And the music was good. It was really good. The tape of Walking on Thin Ice, that was found near John Lennon's body on the pavement outside the Dakota, was eventually returned to Yoko Ono. It contained the final mix that John had approved in the studio, the take he had called The One. The song, when it was released, was exactly as he had left it. Yoko made no changes, no additions, no posthumous adjustments. She released it as John had made it, in the form he had chosen, with the ending he had decided on. New York City breathes. Central Park holds its seasons, cycling through them with the indifferent patience of a space that has contained too much human feeling to be permanently marked by any single instance of it. The Dakota still stands on Central Park West, its Gothic facade unchanged, its gargoyles watching the street below with their carved, impassive eyes. Every year, on December 8th, people gather outside it, not in the vast, overwhelming numbers of those first terrible days, but in the smaller, steadier numbers of people who have decided that some things are worth marking year after year, regardless of whether the world is watching. They bring flowers. They bring candles. They bring his records, worn with playing, their sleeves soft from years of handling. They play his music in the December cold, on portable speakers and on acoustic guitars, sending his songs back out into the city that was his last home, and that has, in the 4 decades since his death, become inseparable from his story. And somewhere in those songs, in the specific, unmistakable quality of a voice that belonged to no one else and sounded like nothing else, the echo of that last Monday persists. A studio, a tape, a man saying that's the one, a door closing softly behind him on a December evening, a city receiving him into its cold, indifferent, beloved streets for the last time. The music plays, the city breathes, and the echo remains, quiet and chilling and absolutely real. What if the most terrifying truth about that last Monday is not what happened at the end of it, but what was still being created at the beginning? What if the most haunting sound in the history of music is not a final note, not a last song, but the silence that fell over a recording studio when the engineer pressed stop on the final take and John Lennon said that's it? That's exactly it. And for one moment, in the warm, humming air of a place where music was made, everything was perfect and complete and exactly right.